Okay, it is 8:01 in Israel, so let's begin. We've got lots and lots of questions this evening, so I'm not going to do the full usual introduction that I do, other than to thank the Rav for giving up his time again for the third Q&A session, and to request everyone please to stay on mute unless asked to unmute. I'm now going to post the other rules and instructions into the chat so that everyone can see them. There we go. So please just look at those rules while speaking. So we're going to start with the first question, which is an anonymous question. Is it permitted to place food on an electric hot plate during Shabbat in order to heat it up?
Very well. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes, very good. It is mutar to heat up food on a what's called in Hebrew a plata, or in English an electric hot plate, assuming that the food was completely cooked before Shabbat. There are different opinions with regards to the question of what kind of food may be heated up on Shabbat. According to what is, it is possible to understand from what Rashi writes. It's not explicit in what Rashi writes, but it's somewhat implicit in what Rashi writes, as the Rosh points out. Foods that are either liquid or contain a liquid, or a gravy, a liquidy gravy, such foods, it seems, again, it's not explicit, but it seems that according to Rashi, such foods may not be heated up on Shabbat. The svara, the understanding being that liquids, when they cool down, even if it is something that has been cooked in the past, because we have the general rule of thumb, the klal, en bishul, ahar bishul, once something is cooked, it cannot be recooked. But it seems that Rashi held that something which is liquid, such as soup, shall we say, once it cools down completely, it is considered now, as it were, uncooked, and by heating it up again, you are recooking it. And therefore, the Rosh and certain other Rishonim follow this opinion, and this is the widely held view nowadays. However, it is a fact that most of the Rishonim, and none of the Gaonim mention such an idea, and most of the Rishonim who speak about this matter either implicitly or explicitly disagree with Rashi. It's clear that Rambam, the Rashba, the Ran, and many others understand that once something is cooked, it is cooked. It does not matter whether it is dry or liquidy, whether it is a soup or some kind of a stew, shall we say, with a liquid component to it. And I have never understood, frankly, and I am not very comfortable saying this, I must admit, because I always feel terribly uncomfortable if I have to admit that I don't understand Rashi, and I would prefer, if I could, to avoid the question, frankly, but I cannot avoid the question. I've never understood the svara, why something which is liquid or has a liquid component to it, if it has cooled down, is no longer considered cooked. It seems to me there is a certain confusion here between other foodstuffs and water, shall we say. The classic example of something which can be recooked is water, because the only definition of cooked water is its heat. Nothing happens to water. It doesn't change its taste or look or consistency when you heat it up. It simply becomes hot, and therefore when it becomes cold, it's no longer cooked. So water that was once mevushal is now not mevushal. And therefore, with regards to water, there is no question that there is such a halacha. But also apparently with regards to shemen, with regards to oil. But with regards to other foods, shall we take a classic example? We're speaking about Shabbat. Most of us like to have chicken soup on Shabbat. Chicken soup is a liquid food. But the fact that it's cold does not mean that it is not chicken soup. It is cold chicken soup. It's not as tasty, I would agree, as hot chicken soup, and most people would not choose to eat it that way, but it is chicken soup. It does not become what it was before it was cooked. It's not as if the soup can now revert to being what it was. It was water and chicken and onions and spices and what have you and salt all mixed together, and then it was cooked for a long time and became soup. You can't undo that process. That's the concept of it in bishul, a har bishul. Whether it's cold or hot seems to me entirely irrelevant. The same is true, for example, with, shall we say, tea. You can drink tea hot, and most of us, most of the time, choose to drink our tea hot. But we all know there's also such a thing as iced tea. Sometimes you prefer to drink tea cold. By the way, the same is true of coffee. There's coffee. Most of us drink coffee most of the time hot, but sometimes it is possible to drink iced coffee. It does not become something other than coffee, or the tea does not become non-tea because it's cold. And therefore, if you were to heat it up again, in other words, a cup of tea that is not hot water that you wish now to turn into tea, that's a different discussion, we'll get to that. But tea that is already tea, a glass of tea, if you wish to heat it up on Shabbat, I do not see why you cannot do so, because it is already tea. And the temperature, it does not seem to me reasonable to claim that has any impact on the question of whether it is bishul or not bishul. This is the opinion of most of the Rishonim, although it is not the standard opinion nowadays. The Temanim do follow this opinion that I'm describing. They do heat up things that are liquid on Shabbat without any hashash, whatever. And to me, this does seem the correct psak halacha. So I just want to sum up. Foods can be heated up on Shabbat, although the standard opinion based on what one can understand from Rashi, keep in mind that this is not mefurash in Chazal, nor is it mefurash even in Rashi, but what one can understand from Rashi, that liquids may not be reheated once they have cooled down. The standard opinion is that one does not do so on Shabbat. To me, this seems without basis in halacha or in logic. The vast majority of the Rishonim and the Kadmonim make this quite clear, and to me this seems to be the correct halacha.
Thank you, Harav. Does one have to place anything on the platter, on the hot plate, as a separation because of the gezerot of Chazara and Hanacha?
Yes, I believe one must do so. We have a good word in English for the kind of implement that I'm about to refer to. It's called a trivet. Not all people perhaps know this word, but in English there's a very good word. It's called a trivet. It is little things that they're not very high, but you can place them under something. It's usually for placing a hot pot on a table or something like that. It has to be made of metal, obviously, if you're going to put it on a hot plate. I do believe you should place something in between the pot or the dish and the hot plate itself. You may also cover the item in question from above, but it must not be covered altogether from all sides, because that is hatmana. So you can place something on top, but it may not be completely encased in some kind of blanket or cover. And there must be something in between the hot plate and the dish or the pot in question.
We're talking about something that the one's putting on the platter on Shabbat during Shabbat.
That is correct.
Okay. And on a related issue, to what extent does the Rav believe that the rules of shehiyah apply in a modern kitchen?
All right. So let's explain what the concept of shehiyah is for those who perhaps do not know. Shehiyah means to leave something or to allow something to remain on the fire or on the place where it is cooked. The classic example, of course, would be a pot in which you're cooking a stew. You would start this stew, let's say, Friday afternoon, at which point, let's say Shabbat is at 6 and now it's 3 p.m. and the stew is cooking away nicely, but it's not ready yet. And it's not going to actually be ready till about, shall we say, for argument's sake, 7 o'clock. So you build up the fire and you can deal with it, of course, up until Shabbat. But let's say the Shkia is at 6, so let's say 5:45, you have to refrain from dealing with it any further. So in the old days, and this is the point, once upon a time, you cooked on a fire, literally. In other words, you had pieces of wood or coals, etc., or something of the like, some flammable material, and you would have to provide enough fuel based on what you estimate is required for it to continue to cook away at the right temperature until you wish to eat it. Now, obviously, this is not going to really work till tomorrow because the fire is going to die down. That is the way of a flame, of a fire, which is the fuel for which is something like wood or coals. So usually this would be for the evening. Now, because of the possibility, and it's a very distinct possibility, it's not a very far-fetched hashash, that a person will see that the flame is not quite as high and quite as hot as he would have thought, as he imagined it would be, and he's concerned that his stew will not be quite the way it should be at 7 p.m. when he wants to eat it. So when he notices this at 6 p.m. or 6:15 p.m., he may be tempted to somehow adjust the pot or move the coals or the flame or the sticks, the wood that is burning in some fashion in order to increase the heat and ensure that it becomes fully cooked. That gzera is called shema yehate b'gehalim, lest a person, in order to complete the cooking of the dish in question, to guarantee that it is cooked properly, doesn't not finish its cooking or becomes cold, the person may be tempted to do something with regards to the coals, with the wood, with the fire, and that, of course, is completely asur. Therefore, certain gezerot were made by Hazal to disallow any such activity, and therefore a kind of food, a stew that is only partially cooked. If it's only partially cooked at 6 o'clock, then you cannot leave it on a flame or on top of the coals, because you may be tempted to adjust things as we described. Whereas if it is completely cooked, and in fact, if by increasing the flame, by increasing the heat, you will simply ruin the food, then you would not be tempted to do so. So there were certain gezerot made with regards to these questions in ancient times. Now, Mori Rabbi Yosef Gafech Zecher Tzadik Livracha writes explicitly in his commentary, in his Perush on the Rambam, that these gezerot are completely irrelevant in a modern kitchen. In other words, generally speaking, the way we cook in our kitchens is not on wood or coals. It is either on some kind of gas flame which doesn't change its temperature, doesn't go up or down in temperature, or some kind of electric source of heat. On top of which, if you place something on a hot plate, most hot plates don't even have the option of changing the temperature. And even if they do, seeing that it is not to be expected, it would be entirely unreasonable for a person to expect that the temperature of the hot plate would all of a sudden decrease, because that's not what happens. A hot plate maintains a certain constant temperature, even if it has 2 or 3 settings, and most of them don't. But even if it does, it's not going to change that temperature. And a person would not be tempted in the same way. One cannot claim that the same hashash, the same possibility exists with regards to an electric hot plate, shall we say, or with regards to a gas flame, which is a constant steady flame covered by some kind of a piece of metal or something under the pot. You cannot claim that is in any way analogous to a wood-fueled fire. So therefore, Rav Gafech wrote, and to me this seems clear and obvious and plain, that these gezerot with regards to shihiha, which means leaving something cooking or on a source of heat erev Shabbat leading into Shabbat, these gezerot do not apply in our situations, in that normal situation today. When I say normal, I stress the word normal. What I mean by normal is the usual situation that pertains in our kitchens, because we have very different utensils, different cooking utensils, different kinds of ovens, etc. However, the gezerah still exists. For example, I remember being asked once by a family that has a practice of going away once or twice a year to the Kinneret for Shabbat. They stay there the whole Shabbat, and they prepare their food before Shabbat on the Friday, and they build a fire with wood and with coals, whatever, and they have what's called a poika, and they bury it, or they place it on top of the fire, or they bury it in the sand, or halfway bury it in the sand. And they ask me certain questions about how to go about what's mutar, what's asur. What I'm getting at is that the gezerah still exists if you happen to be cooking in the same way. If you're using a wood-fueled fire or charcoal or what have you, and that's how you're cooking in this particular instance because you're camping or whatever it is, all these gezerot still exist in exactly the same way. We haven't, halila, we haven't suggested that the gezerah of the Chachamim does not exist. It exists. It just exists in that situation where the facts on the ground are such and such, when they are as described in the Mishnah and the Talmud, which of course then was the normal day-to-day reality. In our days, this is something which is unusual and rare. But if that happens to be the reality, then all those same halachot apply. So therefore, shehiyah in our kitchens today with the hot plates, etc., does not exist. It does not apply.
Okay. Thank you, Harav. We've got a few questions now about hot and Eruvin. This is another anonymous question. What are the criteria for an eruv to be kosher?
To fully answer that question, we would require something like 20 hours of discussion. So we would have to keep things much more basic, fundamental, and straightforward. First of all, when you have a Reshut Harabim, you cannot have an eruv. You cannot carry when you have a Reshut Harabim. However, there are two opinions as to what constitutes a Reshut Harabim. Rashi, and this opinion is mentioned in the name of one Gaon in Sefer Ha'itim, and is subsequently the view of a number of Rishonim. These authorities hold that the definition of a public domain, a Reshut Harabim, is a place where normally 600,000 people use that area, use that place to move, to go about their daily business on a regular daily basis. If that is the case, then there are not that many places in the world today. There are a few, but very few places, if any, in Israel would be that kind of a place where 600,000 people traverse that area regularly. And based on that, you would say that there is no such thing as a Reshut Harabim nowadays. And if that's the case, that it makes it much simpler to claim, at least, that one could have an eruv. The truth is, this does not solve all the problems. There are other issues, without a doubt. There are issues of non-Jews living in the area. There are, or a Jew who lives in the area but doesn't accept the concept of an eruv. How do you get around these problems? Well, the fact is, nowadays it's almost impossible to get around these problems. And that's one of the reasons I do not believe in the standard eruvim. But putting that aside for a moment, on the other hand, the other opinion, which is based on what Chazal say, because Chazal do not mention this requirement of 600,000 people using a place in order for it to be considered Reshut Harabim. If that is not a requirement, then most of our roads and streets are Reshut Harabim. If they're 16 amot, which is 8 meters roughly wide, and they're used by the public, and they're not dead ends, then essentially they are Reshut Harabim. And that immediately, essentially, makes it impossible to discuss an eruv. So where can you have an eruv? You can have an eruv in a courtyard in a certain area which is perhaps shared by a couple of buildings or a number of neighbors or things of that sort. That's called eruv haserut. But to have an eruv around an entire city or an entire town or an entire neighborhood, that is a very different question. Now, Mori wa Rabbi Arav Yosef Gafech Zetzal had a very unique and unusual position on this matter. His claim was, based on his understanding of the Rambam, that a Surat HaPetach is considered Sathum. Let me explain. There is a concept of Surat HaPetach, which is when you create a kind of doorway or entrance by using 3 sticks of wood or metal or what have you. In other words, 2 pieces, one opposite the other and one above them. That's called the Surat HaPetach. Now, it's also considered, this is a general rule of thumb, everyone agrees, that if any area, no matter how large, is entirely surrounded by a wall, shall we say, a wall or a fence, then that entire area is not Reshut HaRabim, it's Reshut HaYahid. So even if you have an area tens of square miles, shall we say, in area completely surrounded by a fence, and there is a gate which can be closed, then that area is considered Reshut HaYahid, a private domain and not a public domain. Another rule of thumb, another klal, is that you can, even if you do not have a wall or a fence which completely encircles that area, but there are certain openings in that fence or that wall, what's called parus. You have parus and you have omed. You have places where there is a wall, where there's a fence, and there are places where there's a gap in the fence. If more than 50% of the area encompassed is surrounded by this wall or fence, and that is sufficient to be considered an area that is surrounded by a wall or a fence. If less than 50%, then it is not good. So if the parus is merubeh al ha-omed, it is not good. It has to be omed merubeh al ha-parus, the area which is covered or surrounded by this fence or wall has to be greater than the area which is not. Rav Gafech was of the view that something which serves as a petach, as an opening, which has a surat petach, which has these 3 pieces of wood or this wall, this doorway reality to it, you can see there's some kind of a doorway there, some kind of an entrance, that area is not to be considered parus, but to be considered omed. It is considered as if it is closed and not open. Now, because we have many questions, and I know I was asked to be brief, I'm not going to go into this whole matter because it's impossible at great length. All I can tell you is that I do not know of anyone else who understood the Rambam or this halakha in this way. I know even some of Rav Gafech's Talmidim found difficulty in understanding his position on this matter. Ania Katan, I found it always very difficult to understand how one could read this into the Rambam, and I do not accept this possibility. The upshot of all this is as follows, that according to Rav Gafech Zetzal, if you have a town, an area, a city, whatever, is surrounded by a so-called wall or a mechisa, which is in fact no wall at all, but really just a wire which goes from post to post, from pole to pole, and surrounds the area in that fashion, that's all considered a surat ha-petach, and it's all considered sathum, even though there's nothing there. You can walk right through it, but because there is this surah of the petach, there is this shape, this look of an entrance to it, because there's something above and something on the sides, you can consider that as if it is a mehisa, as if it's a wall or a fence. So according to Rav Gafech, you could make an eruv with such an arrangement. I cannot accept, and I have never understood, and I'm afraid I cannot understand such an understanding of this halakha or what the Rambam writes, and therefore I reject this concept, and therefore I do not see any possibility of relying on the standard eruvim that we have nowadays in many places, unless we're talking about a place. It can be a town or a yeshuv, or what have you, which has a fence around it completely, or most of it, most of the area surrounded by a fence, and where there's also a gate which is closed or can be closed. Only in such a place, I believe, can one have an eruv.
Thank you, Harav. Another hostile question from this is from Svi in Queens. Can one walk outside with a mask on Shabbat, or with something that covers the face and around the head when it's cold?
The simple answer is yes. One may walk around with a mask or any other kind of covering on the mouth or the head. Everything that one wears in this fashion is derech levush, and it's mutar.
Thank you. Svi, do you need anything clarified there? You may unmute yourself.
Thank you. So it's everything's allowed, masks. Oh, but what about sometimes people take them off?
Well, as with anything else that you wear, such as a hat, if you're walking around in a Shut Rabim, in a place where you cannot carry, then you cannot take it off and hold it in your hand and walk. You have to keep it on your head. In the case of a hat, in the case of the mask, the same holds for the mask as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Arav. Okay. Now I've got a question about the Techum Shabbat. This is from Chaim Ginsberg. His question is, in a suburban area such as Monsey, New York, where in some parts houses are close together, but in others there are houses more than 70.66 amot from each other, would the Techum Shabbat begin outside the city limits, or would one only have 2,000 amot in each direction from his home?
I see there's an additional part.
There was an additional bit about Surat HaPetach. Yes.
Read that perhaps as well.
Okay, sure. So additionally, I've heard one Rav claim that since there is a Surat HaPetach eruv surrounding the city with poles and wires, that even if one does not rely on it to carry, it would still count as an enclosure to mark the whole area as city for Techum purposes. Is this a valid claim?
For two reasons, I believe. First of all, I think that is a reasonable claim, yes, and for another reason as well, I think that the distances specified by Hazal between houses, like Shivim Amot, etc., some of these measurements can be and should be adjusted for our realities. The physical realities of housing, the reality of various types of housing in suburban areas, in city areas, and the way towns and cities and neighborhoods are built nowadays is very frequently very different from the way things were done at that time. And I think we can assume that we can stretch some of these figures to fit, as it were, to fit the reality on the ground nowadays. It's a bit like it's having a picture which you zoom to fill the screen. So if you have an area like in Monsey where you have large areas between the houses, but it's clear that it's all part of the same town, the same neighborhood. It's not distinct from that neighborhood. Then I think, and particularly when you have these poles and wires which do clearly indicate that all this is at least understood by people, is viewed as by people for all practical purposes as one area, one defined area, even though it's not a wall, but it does indicate that there is something which something about this general area surrounded by these wires and poles that make them one. I think it is reasonable to say that the 2,000 amoth begins from that, for those poles and those wires, or basically usually as he asks, as he mentions, the city limits.
Thank you. Chaim, do you have anything to be clarified?
No, that's it. Thank you so much.
Great. Okay. So now on to brushing teeth. This is a question from two people. One was Mayor Morozov and one was anonymous. What toothpaste and toothbrushes are allowed? Is there an issue with squeezing or rubbing in the toothpaste into the gums?
All right. Because I was sent these questions aforetime, I'm going to connect this to another question, which is number 22 on the list of questions, which is hard soap with or without, it says with, moisturizing properties allowed on Shabbat? This is essentially the same question with regarding toothpaste and hard soap. Mori Rabbi Harav Yosef Gafe was of the opinion, and it is also Ania Katan, I hold the same, that this whole halacha of memareah was misunderstood by some of the poskim. To be frank, I thought so even before I heard this from Rav Gafe. This was many, many years ago. It struck me as wrong the moment I heard it, but I wasn't convinced that I should rely on what I thought until I heard the Rav Gafe said and felt the same thing exactly. The concept of memareah is not that you take, for example, toothpaste and you rub it all over your teeth or your gums with a toothpaste or with your finger, however, it doesn't matter. Or that you take a bar of soap, it could be hard soap, and that you, by using it with water and rubbing it around on your hands, we all know what happens to the cake of soap. It begins to dissolve. It's part of that hard soap begins to dissolve onto your hands, and then you wash your hands with it, and you wash it off, and that's it. And the soap is maybe infinitesimally, but somewhat smaller than it was at the beginning of the process. And eventually it disappears. And if there was writing or letters or something on the cake of soap, over time that impression will be lost, will be rubbed away. But that's not the concept of memareah at all. First of all, it goes without saying that you have no interest in rubbing those letters or causing them to disappear or to become less clear than they were before. In fact, quite the opposite is true. If you could buy one cake of soap and use it for the rest of your life because it wouldn't dissolve, you would be quite happy to do so. It would be a great saving. So it's the opposite of what you might be interested in. But the essential thing is that memareah, the concept of memareah, is taking something which is at this point not smooth and smoothing it out in order to achieve a certain purpose. The classic example in the Gemara, for example, is they used to have in their barrels of wine, they used to have an opening for removing the contents. You would place some kind of a tube or something into that hole, and then you could pour out the wine or whatever was in the barrel. Now, if you wanted to seal up that hole, what did you do? You would take a piece of wax and you would put the piece of wax on the hole and you would work it with your thumb, with your finger. You would rub it and work at it until it smoothed over and became a smooth and surface and would seal that hole. That is memareah. When you take a piece of zephet, in English tar, or a piece of wax or some similar material, which is at this point not smooth and not very soft, but it can easily be made smooth and soft by working at it with your hands or with some implement. Excuse me. And you wish to do so for a certain purpose because you need to smooth it out and to make it soft and pliable for a particular purpose that you have in mind. That is memareah. When you take the object, the substance in question, like the piece of wax, which at this point is not quite the right shape and not the right consistency, and by working at it, you turn it into the product, the material that you need of the right consistency, and you're able to smooth it out and cover that hole or whatever it is that you need to do with it. That is memareah. When you take a piece of soap or toothpaste, for that matter, and you rub it onto your hands or you brush it onto your teeth, that is not memareah. that substance is dissolving, but that's not the concept of mimareach. And this whole concept of mimareach, I believe, so, and Rav Gafich writes this explicitly in his Perush on the Rambam, was misunderstood based on a misunderstanding of the Lashon of the Rambam. And he also testified to the fact that in Teman, it was common practice to use hard soap on Shabbat. And that is my view, that you may use even hard soap and kal vachomer soft soap or liquid soap or toothpaste on Shabbat, and that there is no issue of mimareach involved at all.
And no issue of sahita either with brushing teeth.
In regards to toothbrushes, toothbrush bristles are made of some kind of nylon or other kind of substance which does not absorb water. Water is caught, small particles of water are caught between the bristles, but the bristles themselves do not absorb water, and therefore they are exactly like hair, like se'ar. In the Talmud it states explicitly, en sahita b'se'ar, there is no such thing as sahita, of squeezing water out of hair, because each hair does not, the hairs themselves, each hair in our head or on an animal's body also, the water is not absorbed by the hair. The hair is a hard and impervious material to water. The water is caught between the hairs as opposed to a garment. Take a cotton garment, shall we say, which is very absorbent, so it's a good example, but the same is true for almost all garments. The fibers of the garment itself actually absorb water. So when you are sohet, when you take a t-shirt, let's say, that was soaked in the soapy water to make it clean, and then you take it in your hands and you wring it on Shabbat, that's called sahita, that's called melaben. That's part of the process of laundering, of cleaning clothing. You have to remove that water, and that water is actually in the fibers in the garment itself. It's completely saturated with the water, as opposed to se'ar. Now, I know it's true that some Rishonim claim that en sahita b'se'ar is only min Torah, but midarabanan there is sahita b'se'ar. I do not accept this opinion. That is clearly not the view of the Rambam. It is not the view of the Ran, and not the view of others. It is not logical. There's no hint of such a thing in the Talmud, and it doesn't follow from any of the sugyot that discuss this. It does not follow at all.
Okay.
And therefore, just as hair there's no sahita b'se'ar with hair, there is also no sahita, I believe, with the bristles of the toothbrush, and therefore one may use a toothbrush on Shabbat. With regards to toothbrushes, I will just add that, first of all, for halachic reasons, and second of all, for dental reasons, medical reasons, it's not a good idea to use a hard toothbrush. This is something all dentists will also tell you. You should use a soft toothbrush. And on Shabbat, you should be somewhat more careful about brushing too vigorously, which is also something which the dentists and the dental technicians advise against. Brushing is a good idea. Brushing with too much vigor is not a good idea. On Shabbat, it's not a good idea because of the possibility of blood being released by the gums. Now, a healthy gum does not release any blood unless it's really dealt with quite harshly. Some people have certain medical issues with their gums, which at this point I will mention has nothing to do with halachic questions, but it has to do with medical advice. It's a good idea to look into that. It's not a good condition. So if a person knows that one's gums always bleed when they brush their teeth, that's something to look into. And then you have a problem on Shabbat, yes, because you cannot do something which causes blood to be released on Shabbat. In which case I would suggest, until that problem is solved, I would suggest finding some other solution, using mouthwash, etc., and not brushing the normal fashion. A normal person with reasonably healthy gums should not have any issue, and therefore a soft toothbrush is not a problem.
Okay, thank you, Harav. I don't see Meir on the line, so we'll go on to the next question, which is also from Meir Morozov. At what temperature is water considered hot enough to cook?
Okay, this is a very important question. All the questions are important and all very relevant, by the way. And this is a common, when I say important, I mean to say it's a very common and practical halakha that we need to understand. And this also connects to another question that was sent here, which has to do with where is it? Sheni and shlishi.
There was a question. Yeah, question number 12, maybe.
That's number 12. Why isn't kli shlishi sufficient to enable making tea on Shabbat? Is there a real practically applicable concept of kli shlishi in halakha? Okay, so these questions are obviously connected. Let us begin at the beginning. Again, we're trying to keep it brief, but we have to understand some of the basics. Hazal discuss the concept of kli rishon and kli sheni. Kli rishon is the vessel, the pot, in which food is cooked on the fire, on the source of heat, and it remains a kli rishon even if you remove it from the heat. So let's say you have a pot of soup. You cook the soup obviously on the fire. So let's say on your gas range, that's a kli rishon. Even when you remove it from the fire, or even when you remove it, shall we say, from the hot plate, let's say the chicken soup on Leil Shabbat, that is still a kli rishon, because as long as it's very hot, it's still considered a kli rishon. A kli sheni is when you take the contents of the kli rishon, when it's very hot, and pour it into another vessel, as some people do. They take the soup from the pot on Shabbat, or any other day of the week for that matter, and they place it in some kind of large serving bowl, and then they bring it to the table. That's called a kli sheni. Why is it a kli sheni? Why does it make a difference if we call it rishon or sheni? Because the sheni is obviously cooler than the rishon, because it began cool, unless it was somehow heated up beforehand, which is not normally the case. It began cold, you put into it hot soup, so now it becomes hot, but it's not the same heat at all as the kli rishon was. And therefore, there is an halachic difference between kli rishon and kli sheni. What is the difference? Kli rishon is mevashel. Kli rishon cooks things, and kli sheni doesn't cook things. Now, when we speak about cooking things, Hazal, we're referring to the standard things that people cook, that need to be cooked to be eaten. Classic examples: a piece of meat, a potato, onions, etc. All the things that you would put into some kind of cholent, some kind of stew, shall we say, or a soup or something like that. When you take a piece of meat, let's say a piece of beef or a piece of chicken, and you put it into a kli rishon, into a pot, even if it's on the flame, on the boil, it doesn't cook immediately. It takes quite some time to cook, correct? If you were to take that very hot, that boiling pot of water off the flame, it's still very hot, but if you put the meat inside it now, it won't really cook. What might happen is that the kalipa, the outer membrane, the very half a centimeter in thickness on the outside of the piece of meat might become cooked, but the rest of it will not become cooked because it takes some time to do this. The same is true if you take any normal-sized potato and you put it into boiling water. You want to cook a potato, it takes a fair amount of time. It takes something like half an hour to cook a potato in boiling water, at least. If you put it even to a hot pot that was removed from the flame, it won't cook. So generally, but there are certain things that if you put a stick of celery, shall we say, into a very hot pot of soup, which is a kli rishon that was removed from the flame or from the plata, and you put into it a raw piece, a stick of celery, you left it there for a while, it might cook to some extent or maybe completely. So a kli rishon can cook. A kli sheni does not cook. In other words, if you take that same stick of celery and put it in a kli sheni, even a stick of celery, it will not cook. It might become a bit softer, but it won't become cooked. Whereas if you speak about a piece of meat or a potato, of course, a kli sheni will never cook. It's just not going to happen. So, and therefore, based on these simple observable realities with which we are all familiar, a kli rishon is mevashel, a kli sheni is not mevashel, doesn't cook. Now, something that many people do not realize is the following. The concept of a kli shlishi is an invented concept. In other words, Hazal never speak about it. There's no such thing as a kli shlishi in the Gemara, in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, in the Rambam, or in the Shulchan Aruch for that matter. There's no such thing as a kli shlishi. It speaks about kli rishon and kli sheni. However, there is also a certain category of foods known as what we refer to nowadays usually as qalei habishul. Qalei habishul means things which are easily cooked. The classic example in the Mishnah, Daf Kof Mem He Amud Bet in Masechet Shabbat, in the Mishnah is, for example, a kind of fish referred to there as kulias ha'ispanin. Some claim this refers to a type of mackerel. It's a kind of fish which does not require to be cooked, to be eaten. All it needs to be done is for it to be held under a stream of hot water which is poured over it. You just pour hot water over this fish because it's small and thin, and that makes it edible. So basically that is its cooking. That's the extent of cooking that is required. That's the example, one of the examples given right there by the Mishnah. The Mishnah states explicitly that you may not, therefore, pour hot water over such a small fish or over some other kind of meat or fish that is very hard, such as some kind of salted product and salted and dried fish or meat. It is inedible at this point in time, but if you pour hot water over it or soak it in very hot water, it will become edible and delicious. And that is the extent of cooking that is required for this particular item. The Mishnah states explicitly that if you do that on Shabbat, you are hayav mishum mevashel min Torah. That is considered cooking min Torah, because cooking is all about preparing something which is either inedible or not in the normal state where we would want to eat it, and preparing it and making it edible and desirable in the normal way by means of heat. As Rambam writes, cooking is, and this applies by the way not only to food, you can cook also metal. That is to say, if you melt metal or you cause a piece of metal to achieve a heat whereby it glows, that is called bishul of that particular kind of metal. In other words, many things can be cooked. Cooking is, the concept of bishul is a very wide-ranging concept. It applies to food and it applies to other materials as well. When we make a change to something, to an item, by way of heat, which makes it more desirable for the purpose for which we require it, that is called bishul. Now, the classic example of something which is kala bishul, which is very easily cooked, are tea leaves. And obviously they are more readily cooked than any kind of small fish or any kind of salted, dried piece of meat or fish that Hazal were referring to in that Mishnah. There is nothing that is as easily cooked, I think, as tea leaves that requires cooking. And it must be pointed out, if one looks in, excuse me, if one looks in the Mishnah Brura in Siman Shin Yod Heth regarding making tea on Shabbat, he never entertains for one moment the notion that you can prepare tea by way of a kli shlishi. If this were the case, then that would have been that's the simplest solution. What's difficult about a kli shlishi? You have a meham, you have an urn on Shabbat. You take water from the urn into a glass. That's now a kli sheni, because the urn, which is constantly kept hot, is a kli rishon. Water in the glass is a kli sheni. Pour that into a second glass. That's now kli shlishi. Put your tea leaves or tea bag into it, and you have a cup of tea. And we all know that works. If you do that, you will have a cup of tea. It won't be as hot as a cup of tea that you prepare during the week, for obvious reasons. It may not be as quite the same taste as the cup of tea you can make on another day of the week, especially if you are a bit of a maven when it comes to tea. But it is definitely a passable cup of tea. It is hot, it tastes like tea, and people manage with it absolutely fine. And if that were a possibility, there would have been nothing simpler for all the Achronim who discuss the making of tea, such as the Hafetz Chaim in the Mishnah Brura, to suggest such a thing. The fact of the matter is, they didn't, for the very simple reason, because there is actually no difference between a kli sheni and a kli shlishi if in fact the particular thing in question, such as tea leaves, are cooked by either. And the Chazon Ish writes this explicitly, that there is actually no difference between a kli sheni and a kli shlishi if they both do the job. And we all know they do the job. Now, at this point, I feel I must relate a certain event, a certain anecdotal story that I wish to relate to you. I think it's relevant. About 10 years ago, I was visiting in Australia, and I was staying at a certain person's home, and we were sitting there on Friday night, and at the end of the meal, we wanted tea. And there was another guest in the home from Israel, and when it came to the question of tea, apparently the people of the house had not pre-prepared tea before Shabbat, so I said, I'll have instant coffee or I'll have hot water. That's what I usually say. When there's no pre-prepared tea that was prepared before Shabbat fully, as I will explain in a moment, then I don't drink the tea. I will not drink tea made from a tea bag on Shabbat, in a kli shlishi, or even a kli revi'i for that matter, as I will explain. So this person said, wait a second, why don't you drink from a kli shlishi? I said, well, I went into it and I explained why. And he said, well, I just bought this book. He actually showed me the book. He was referring to, in fact, I even have the book here and I will show it to you. This is the book right here. If you can see it. Pnine Halacha by Rav Eliezer Melamed, Shabbat Chelik Aleph. At that time, I think it was brand new. It just come out. And he said to me, it says here that you can make tea in a kli shlishi. So I said, well, let's have a look first what it says. So we had to look at what it says, and that's in fact what it says. And then he said to me, I saw somewhere that the reason that you can make tea in a kli shlishi is because water in a kli shlishi is not yad soledet bo, because you can put your finger, it's not so hot that you can't touch it. So I said to him, really, that's very interesting. Well, let's try it. Let's make a little experiment. So I went over. This is a home where I've stayed a few times. I'm quite comfortable there. I got up, I went to the cupboard, I took out a tea glass, and I filled it up with some water from the urn, and then I poured it into a second cup, and then I said to him, please put your finger in it. And he did, and then he immediately withdrew his finger together with the exclamation, ouch, because he burned his finger because the water is quite hot. I said, well, you see, therefore, a kli shlishi is, generally speaking, usually yad soledet bo, and I'm not even sure you need yad soledet bo to make a decent cup of tea. It might be that 40 degrees, 45 degrees, which is borderline yad soledet bo. Yad soledet bo, depending on whom you ask, is anywhere from 45 to 50, 51 degrees. I'm not even sure you need actually yad soledet bo to cook a cup of tea. I will tell you something else that I did last night as an experiment leading up to this question and answer session. Last night after Havdalah, I took a glass of water, cold water, and I placed in it a cheap, very poor, I must add, Vysotsky tea bag, the kind of tea that I never drink, but it's in the cupboard, so it's perfectly good for an experiment. And if you want to hear another time about the quality of such tea, we can discuss that, but that's not the issue at the moment. I took this cheapy Vysotsky tea bag that most Israelis think is really wonderful tea, and I placed it in this cold water, and I let it sit there for 2 hours. After 2 hours, the water had changed color, and I decided to taste it. I can tell you that the taste of tea in the water was almost imperceptible, and the color of the water was certainly darker than it had been at the outset, but it was not, in my opinion, the same color as it would have been had I used boiling water to make a cup of tea, as one normally would. And I went further and I made another experiment. Then I took another tea bag, the same kind, I put it in a glass of water and poured boiling water over it. And then I let it cool down. And then I tasted it. First of all, the color was much darker and the taste was different. It tasted more like cold tea. And then I took that same, and then I also did something further. I took the cold tea, the tea that had only been cold water all along, in which this tea bag had been sitting in cold water, and then I heated it up in the microwave till it boiled. So the water in the glass now boiled, but it never been, but I had removed the tea bag, so it was just the water that had been with the tea for 2 hours, in cold water, but had never been cooked in hot water. And now I just heated up the water and I tasted that. The taste of that water was, there was a almost imperceptible type of flavor of tea to it, but very, very, very weak, very unsatisfactory. Nothing like a cup of tea that you make in a shlishi. The point of all this is to tell you that this is simply a fiction. I can also tell you that in Siman Shin Yod Het Yaroch HaShulchan, Rabbi Yehiel Michel Epstein, a tremendous posek, whose view should always be taken very, very seriously. He writes explicitly with regards to making tea, that tea may be cooked in a shlishi, or even more. If you do cook place tea leaves, he says, in a shlishi, it will definitely become cooked. In other words, he rejects this idea out of hand, similar to the Chazon Ish, who said there's no difference between a sheni and a shlishi if, in practical terms, they do the same job. And this is exactly what the Mishnah Berurah, the Hafetz Chaim, writes. The Mishnah Berurah writes explicitly that the only way to drink tea on Shabbat is by making the tea beforehand. I don't want to go into all the details now. You can read it there for yourself. In Siman Shin Yod Het, he describes exactly how you can make tea. I agree with everything it says there, except for one minor point, and that is because I explained before that I hold, like most of the Rishonim, like the Rambam, like the Rashba, like the Ran, that something which is liquid but cooked may be reheated on Shabbat. That I therefore have no problem with taking, or let me explain this. What I do is I prepare tea before Shabbat. I take a teapot, I put tea in it, I pour boiling water over it, and it sits there. I do this before Shabbat, a couple of hours before Shabbat, shall we say. On Shabbat, I don't keep it on the hot plate or on top of the urn. I don't keep that hot. That tea, that is cooked tea now. That is now, it's cool. It's like iced tea now, but it's also concentrated. I pour a small amount of that into the cup, and then I add hot water to it. I'm not concerned about cooking the cold tea because it's already been cooked. And the fact that it's liquid, as I said, does not concern me. So that is possible. According to the Mishnah Berurah, who says you can't do that either because it's liquid and it's cold and therefore you can't reheat it. So you have to do the other way around. You would have to put hot water into a sheni or maybe into a shlishi even, and then add the tea essence, or the concentrated tea, into that. There are also those who say you have to keep the teapot on top of the urn or on top of the plata all of Shabbat. As I explained, in my view, that's not necessary. But to claim, the claim that you can make tea in a shlishi, I believe was first made by Hagaon Rabbeinu Moshe Feinstein. And he does not bring any real proof for this concept at all. And the reality there before our eyes is quite the opposite. And the idea had occurred to the Aruch HaShulchan, and he explicitly rejects it. And I too reject this idea completely.
Thank you, Harav. Binyamin, one of those questions was yours. Do you have anything to have clarified?
No, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. We've got 1 minute left, so just a final question about Tosefet Shabbat. It's a combination of questions from Gabriel Martindale in Yerushalayim and Yehoshua Felberg in Harish. The official minhag in Yerushalayim is to accept Shabbat and Yom Tov 40 minutes before sunset. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef opposed this practice, but many people who theoretically hold by it are very flexible about when they light candles. And the men do malacha up until they daven mincha, which can be just a few minutes before sunset. Does this practice and similar ones in other cities have a status of a binding minhag makom? And what if there are multiple minhagim in one city? And in general, how should one conduct oneself with regards to Tosefet Shabbat?
Very well. There are a number of questions encapsulated in all of that. So briefly, throughout the world, the standard time, although this is not based on any hard and fast halacha, the standard time for lighting candles is approximately 20 minutes or sometimes 18 minutes before sunset, which is a good time to light. Why? Because you cannot wait to the last moment, as we've discussed in earlier shiurim. You have to accept Shabbat before the sun sets. How much before the sun sets? Chazal do not state. Chazal state that you may do a number of different melachot im shemesh, when the sun is still visible, when it's still shining. But obviously you cannot cut things too fine. It's a very reasonable and correct practice to tell people, light your candles 20 minutes before Shabbat. And that is what goes on in most of the world. In some places they say 30 minutes. I think that's also a great idea, because people tend to be running late erev Shabbat, as is explicitly mentioned in the Gemara also. It's not just nowadays, it was always the case that we're often running late erev Shabbat. This is not a good thing, but it tends to happen a lot. So it's always a good idea to tell people you have to light candles and stop doing everything 20 minutes before, at least 20 minutes before Shabbat. In Yerushalayim, about 150 or something odd years ago, a minhag began based on one opinion of one of the Rishonim, Rabbeinu Eliezer Mimetz, Bal HaYireim, who has a very unusual and completely individual, that is to say, he's a Dat Yahid completely with regards, he has a very unusual position with regards to Ben HaShemashot and when Shabbat begins and all the rest of it. Without going into any of the details, in order to take into account his view, the minhag in Yerushalayim was established at that time when there were very few people living in Yerushalayim. We're talking about the mid-19th century, the Minyanam, and almost all those Jews, the vast majority were Ashkenazim. They decided in Yerushalayim we're going to light candles 40 minutes before Shabbat. Now, and this is why Rav Yosef, who did not like the idea that Ashkenazim would dictate to Sfaradim how they should behave, and essentially, I think he was entirely correct. This is why Rav Yosef Zatzal did not like this idea, and he told people you don't have to abide by this 40-minute minhag. I think it was always a dubious minhag, and it was certainly not. It cannot be considered binding for all the Jews who came to Yerushalayim after that time, and I'm very dubious whether it can be considered binding or minhag makom even at that time. So in practice, yes, some people in Yerushalayim keep the 40-minute minhag, others do not. Many of the Sfaradim do not. Practically, a lot of people, again, because they're running late or whatever it is, they don't actually stop doing melacha 40 minutes before Shabbat. I do not believe that is considered or should be considered a minhag makom. The halacha is that one has to stop doing melacha well before Shabbat. How much before Shabbat? It is not specified. The concept of Tosefet Shabbat, which is that you must add a certain period of time, again, non-specified, before Shabbat, when you don't do malacha, is also a mahloket, as we discussed. According to the Yerushalmi, according to the Rambam, there's no such concept. But still, even according to that, you have to stop doing malacha at least some perceptible time before the sun sets. In order not to run into problems, one should always try and accept Shabbat half an hour, 20 minutes before Shabbat. That's a very good time to accept Shabbat, but certainly one should not cut things too fine. I do not consider any of these things to be a minhag makom, really. In many places, as this question points out, there are different minhagim. In large cities, you have different practices, so you really cannot talk about a minhag makom of the ear of the city. You can speak about a minhag of a neighborhood, perhaps, or a certain social grouping, that's like a Hasidut, that has a certain practice. Practically speaking, we should all do our utmost to prepare for Shabbat on time, if necessary, starting on Thursday, doing things on Thursday night, Friday morning, so that we don't run into problems. This is a common problem. It's a big problem. We all know this. We all are aware of the problem, and we should always do our utmost to avoid this problem, which is a very big problem. You do not want to run into any real question of possible Chilul Shabbat, and therefore we should always light candles well before the sun sets, and we should refrain from doing any melacha when the sun is still clearly visible. That is the halacha, and I think that is sufficient for now.
Okay. Thank you, Harav. Yoshua, do you have anything there to be clarified?
No, thank you very much.
Great, and Gabrielle?
Yes, if I may. After you've accepted Shabbat, whenever that time is, let's say 20 minutes before Shabbat, is it proper to then daven mincha afterwards, or should one daven mincha before one accepts Shabbat?
One can daven mincha as long as until the sun sets, as any other day of the week. Zman mincha is ad ha'erev. The word erev there means sunset. one can daven mincha till that time. Even if one decided, I am not going to do melacha from this point on, it doesn't mean you cannot do Shabbat. You cannot daven mincha. You would only not be able to daven mincha if you had already davened arvit shel Shabbat as part of your being mekabel Shabbat, as accepting the Shabbat. But otherwise, it's a good idea not to do melacha perhaps from even before you daven mincha, but it doesn't prevent you from davening mincha.
However, if I can just indulge in a related question, if one is wearing tefillin for mincha, can one keep the tefillin on until after one's always been mekabel Shabbat?
One may wear tefillin right up until the sun sets. And I once saw, now I will add the following. In the world of Sfaradi Psak Halacha, which has been completely revolutionized and changed over the last few centuries by all manner of Kabbalistic considerations and understandings and teachings, you will find that one should not wear tefillin after midday on Friday. And this, of course, is an idea which does not square with what we find in the Mishnah, the Talmud, or any of the early sources, because Friday is not Shabbat. And wearing tefillin is a mitzvah right up until Shabbat. And we see this in the Talmud. It talks about a person running late and arriving in the town at the beginning of Shabbat with his tefillin still on his head. What does he do? So obviously he was wearing tefillin just before Shabbat. I remember seeing many years ago, I'm talking about something like 35 years ago, in a certain book, I do not recall exactly the name or the provenance of that book, but I do recall that I saw this was a person, there in this book was quoted a statement by someone who knew the Ari, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria Ashkenazi of Tzfat, the well-known Mekubal, Kabbalist. And he knew the Ari personally, and he states that the Ari removed his tefillin just as before the sun set on Friday, which proves two things: that yes, you should wear tefillin until Shabbat, and B, that this Kabbalistic notion is to be rejected out of hand, and is in fact not what the Ari, who was a Mekubal, not what he thought and not what he did at all. And this is true, and from this you can understand that there are many statements and ideas claimed by latter-day Mekubalim that many earlier Mekubalim would have rejected. There are many very speculative and unreliable ideas out there which are quoted in the name of or supposedly based on some Kabbalistic reason. Many of them are dubious in the extreme.
Whose shkia was the Ari wearing tefillin up until?
Whose shkia or which tefillin?
Well, I was asking which shkia up until shkia or shitat hagaonim or shkia Rabbeinu Tam.
Well, it doesn't.
Shkia.
I imagine he was talking about the standard visible sunset that we all know.
Okay, thank you very much, Harav. I apologize to everyone who didn't get their questions answered, but I think we covered some good ground. Thank you very much to the Rav for doing this on a third occasion. And
if I may, I feel
yes,
another few words with regards to the making of tea and coffee on Shabbat, because it's a practical, recurring issue that everyone needs to know and should understand. Everything I said with regards to tea applies also to coffee. This is also pointed out explicitly by the Mishnah Brura and explicitly pointed out by the Ruch HaShulchan, and it's all common sense. Something which requires much less than boiling water to be cooked, even though boiling water is perhaps the ideal, any such thing is considered to be mevushal, and you are not allowed to do so on Shabbat, with a water at a considerably lower temperature than boiling. So as we explained, kli shlishi is not permissible, not for putting a tea bag. You may not put a tea bag into a kli shlishi. You may not put loose tea leaves, I should say, not in a tea bag into a kli shlishi or even I would say even to a clear revi'i, because by doing so you will get a passable cup of tea. The same is true of Turkish, or what's called Turkish or black coffee. If you take, and I must explain this because I think it's important that people understand these concepts, because most people drink either tea or coffee on Shabbat. Coffee beans, having been removed from the tree, are dried. And then they are, generally speaking, almost without exception, they are roasted. And then they are ground into a powder. And that is what we call, what is called in Israel or many places, Turkish coffee or black coffee. That is raw, uncooked coffee. If you take that coffee and put it into a glass of cold water, as I did last night with a tea bag, what you will get is absolutely nothing. It will be something completely undrinkable. Won't even be remotely similar to anything that you might call coffee, because that coffee has never been cooked. It has been, the beans were roasted, yes, but they were not cooked in water, and there is a big difference. And the claim that is made by some, and because I've seen this claim, someone writes here, if you make a cold brew, if you wait 12 hours, that's absolutely true. This is exactly the same thing as I said about the tea bag. I waited only 2 hours last night before I tasted the tea. Yes, if I leave a tea bag in cold water for 2 days, well, that will be kavush. Kavush is a concept in halacha which means either preserving or pickling things. And essentially, many things, if you leave them even just plain water, not even necessarily mei melach, salt water or vinegar or other substances of that like, and many things, you put them in water and leave them there for a long time, the water will absorb some of the flavor of that substance. So yes, if you put a tea bag into a glass of cold water and leave it there for 2 days, you will get a liquid that tastes more or less like tea, yes. That didn't happen last night when I did it after 2 hours, but if you wait 2 days, it will happen, because that is the nature of the thing. That is called kavush. According to many poskim, that would be considered kavush. And in reality, that's the reality. Cold water, you place something even into cold water for an extended period of time, it will absorb and take on some of that flavor. Maybe not to the same extent as cooking, but it will take on some of that flavor. Maybe with certain substances, exactly the same as the process of cooking. The difference, of course, is that cooking is something that takes place quickly in a few moments, and something like kavisha, something where you place things in cold water and wait a long time, that doesn't take place quickly. There is a halachic concept that kavushu karoteh, that kavush is like mevushal. That something which is kavush, which sits is pickled or preserved, is like it was cooked in that substance. It absorbs the flavors, and we all know this is true. That's why we have pickled cucumbers and all kinds of other vegetables and what have you, things that are pickled and preserved. If you take uncooked black coffee, even though it was roasted in an oven, you put it in cold water or even lukewarm water, you will not get a decent cup of coffee. If you put it in a shlishi, as we described, you take a cup, you put it out with water from the urn, you pour that into another cup, and then you immediately put coffee into it, you will get a cup of coffee. Yes, it won't be quite the same as the coffee you make on Sunday morning, but it will be a cup of coffee, because the temperature is sufficient to cook it to an extent which is acceptable. Perhaps you would go out of business if you serve that kind of coffee on a regular basis. If you had a cafe, people would not be impressed with the result, but it is possible, and people do drink that kind of coffee and they don't complain. And that proves that it is being cooked. Now, why do I say that the roasting is not the same as cooking? First of all, it's important to understand, roasting coffee beans is like roasting cashews, for example. You can eat raw cashews. Why do people generally roast cashews or other nuts? Because it improves the flavor. It enhances the flavor. It brings out certain flavors. It makes the flavors stronger. The same is true with a coffee bean. If you take a coffee bean and dry it and grind it into a powder, you can make coffee from it. You will get coffee. It won't be as tasty as when you first roast the coffee beans, because the roasting enhances the flavor. That's the reality. That's why we roast them. But unroasted coffee beans, when ground, will also produce coffee. The Temanim, for example, drink a kind of coffee which is based on the outer shell of the coffee bean, which is not necessarily roasted, and it produces a certain kind of drink. My point, therefore, is that cooking in hot water or roasting in an oven, like as we do with nuts or coffee beans or cocoa beans, is not the same thing. One does not come in place of the other. There is probably need for us to discuss on another occasion the concept of bishul, if there is bishul ahar afiyah or tzli'ah ahar bishul, in other words, grilling meat after it's been cooked or vice versa. When does this apply? When does it not apply? That's a separate discussion. We won't go into it now, but I want to make it absolutely clear. The only kind of coffee you can drink or you can prepare on Shabbat is instant coffee. And the reason for that is because instant coffee was cooked in hot water and then it was dried. It was freeze-dried. And then when you add hot water to it, you have hot coffee. But you take that same instant coffee and you put cold water, mix it with cold water, you also get a cup of coffee because it was already cooked. It just will be cold. It'll be iced coffee. And maybe that's not what you want, but it'll be perfectly reasonable coffee, except for the temperature, which in the middle of summer may be to your liking. Just as it is with tea. Tea in cold water, in a short space of time, does not produce tea. After days, it might produce something, but that's not a process called bishul. That's not cooking. That is a process called kivisha, or whatever term you wish to use. That is a different reality altogether, and we're discussing bishul. Bishul always involves heat, and the only question we need to ask ourselves is, with regards to this specific substance, does the heat that we have here before us, is that heat sufficient to cook this particular substance? So a shlishi will not cook a potato, certainly not, but it will cook tea leaves or black coffee. So if you want to drink black coffee, that is to say Turkish coffee, on Shabbat, you have to prepare it before Shabbat. Quite possible. The same as with tea.
Okay, thank you very much, Harav, and thank you for everyone for taking part.
Shalom, kol tov.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.